The following podcast is a Dear Media production.
This is Treated with Dr. Sara. Real talk, real science, real solutions. Welcome to Treated with Dr. Sara, where we blend hard science with deep soul to decode the inner workings of being a human today, mind, body, and hormones included. I'm your host, Dr. Sara Zoll, and today I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with someone whose work I deeply admire, Dr. Nicole LePera. If you've ever felt jaded by therapy, wary of self-help jargon, or skeptical of the never-ending stream of social media wellness advice, stay with us. Dr. LePera, also known as a holistic psychologist, has this rare gift. She cuts through the noise with clarity, compassion, and truth. Her work is grounded in years of clinical experience, fused with deep psychological insight and a fierce commitment to healing from the inside out. I see her as a kind of sacred translator, someone who takes the complexity of the human nervous system and makes it make sense for real life, especially for women navigating a dysregulating world. Dr. LePera holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the New School for Social Research. She earned her undergraduate degree from Cornell, and she's the author of multiple best-selling books, most recently the #1 New York Times bestseller, How to Be the Love You Seek. Her voice is changing how we understand mental health, relationships, and the mind-body connection, especially for women who've been carrying too much for too long. This reminds me, if something resonates from today's podcast, please share it with friends and family. We need to do our part to regulate ourselves and each other, a process known as co-regulation. We need it now more than ever. In today's conversation, Nicole and I are digging into the biology of burnout. We're going to unpack the buzzwords you've heard: dysregulation, cortisol, boundaries. We're going to talk about what they actually mean for your brain, your hormones, and your relationships. We'll explore what dysregulation really is, why women are uniquely vulnerable to it, although men suffer too, why cortisol, the body's main stress hormone, deserves more airtime, how boundaries aren't just emotional walls, but biological safeguards, and most importantly, how to reset your nervous system so that you're not just surviving, but actually thriving. This is the healing conversation I wish every person could hear. So grab your tea, take a deep breath, and let's drop in. Dr. Nicole LePera, it is such an honor to be in conversation with you.
I am so grateful to be here. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
I feel like we live in the United States of dysregulation, and you are my go-to person for understanding dysregulation, for having a sense of how we recognize it in the body, and then, perhaps most importantly, what we do about it. So I wonder if we could start there. Could you share with us the way that you think about dysregulation and also maybe what some of the signs are?
Giggling when I heard you describe the United States of dysregulation. I think there's so much truth in that. And I really see our culture as largely a reflection of the dysregulation. For a lot of us, the generations of trauma that have been epigenetically passed on to us. And I think it really is kind of the byproduct of that reflection, if you will. Humans, collective, a society that is dysregulated, that ultimately the culture itself begins to mirror. And again, I wouldn't have even training in clinical psychology. I didn't have the depth of understanding of the role that dysregulation played. And when I say dysregulation, I'm really kind of hammering down to the core, which is the role our nervous system played in, if I really want to be general and global about it, as I think I can be, in creating our human experience. And I say that because without that language, I had spent many years on the personal side of my journey struggling with dysregulation. The word, of course, I would have used, as I'm imagining many listeners use themselves, is anxiety. And as long as I can remember, I was quite literally the little girl afraid of the world, hiding under tables, not wanting to talk to strangers, afraid of every bump in the night. My 20s were just one panic attack after another. The only language I had at that time was, oh, of course, Nicole, you have anxiety. That is a byproduct of something genetically missing, if you will. Of course, I'm simplifying, right? And seeing similar habits, anxiety-based behaviors in my family, I thought, oh, well, of course, I have this because I see the genetic similarity or the expression, I should say, of that. And without understanding, again, the role that the nervous system played and the reality that a lot of the environments beginning in our earliest environments, beginning in our relational environments, I should say, how that really does impact not only the creation or the wiring of our nervous system, but it's functioning well into life. And so what I continue to see now into my practice, being trained, right, being what I believed was an integrative therapist, trying to give practical tools outside of the session. And what I really understood again is how first disempowered that I felt right alongside of my clients when it seemed to me that much like the experience I was having in my personal life, no amount of intervention was working. And so for me, again, that felt really disempowering. I felt really powerless. I felt really ineffectual as a clinician in the room, let alone I'd given up hope by that point that I experienced personally life any other way outside of anxiety. So really simply, again, I really truly understood and began to understand at that time, very thankfully, the science of the body that included the nervous system, that included dysregulation, that included very common signs or symptoms that I think a lot of us begin to categorize or have had categorized, like much like me, right? As these inevitable, intrinsic diseases, disorders, whatever we want to call it, that we can't actually affect change on. So for me, those symptoms really kind of range from those of us that are feeling as much like the culture, right? Always on edge, always a sense of urgency, not being able to be calmly grounded in our body, always feeling reactive. I think the other side of that is a huge category of people that feel so shut down.
Thank you so much. There are many directions that I want to go. One piece that I want to call out is the skill, the talent, the gift that you have for talking about your own experience. There's a way that I was trained in medical school and in my residency to not talk about myself, to focus only on the patient's story, the client's story. And yet, I feel like, especially as women, talking about the female experience is so important. So I want to thank you for your vulnerability, for talking about anxiety. And I also appreciate how you widened the opening to the tent, because I want folks here at the beginning, if you're someone who feels anxious and dysregulation feels like it could be related to that anxiety, as you've described, I feel like this piece of functional dissociation, kind of the way that we numb out when we're dysregulated, is also such an important piece, because those folks often don't feel anxious. They don't feel much at all. And so I wonder if you could share with us some of the most common signs that are particular to women. What's the difference? I focus a lot on sex and gender differences, so I'm happy to riff with you here. But some of the patterns that I see, for instance, if we think of a classic stress response and the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, which was originally described in men, doesn't capture a lot of what women do. We tend to freeze, we tend to fawn, we tend to faint. And so I wonder if you could share with us, what have you seen, what have you noticed, especially in women?
I'm actually smiling as you're describing freeze, fawn, and faint, because those are definitely the categories that expressed or the way my nervous system kind of landed in terms of dealing with, as I was sharing, lifetime anxiety. And I absolutely agree. I think that there are different adaptations that happen across culture, across gender, of course, across family lineage included as well, that do then kind of give different patterning. I think some of this comes culturally through the ages. I mean, there was a real time, not even in the so distant past, where women were completely dependent in terms of resources, in terms of finances, in terms of really anything. Women found themselves largely by law in some areas, even to this day in some areas, in a state of dependency. And the reason why I'm focusing on that, right? When we mobilized energy is very helpful, that fight or flight response, that first step that our nervous system takes to really activate. And so when we can't flee as is the case for all of us in childhood when we're completely dependent. Some of us, again, based on our culture, based on our gender, based on our just conditioning in general, based on where we live, based on our resources, if and when we continue to chronically or consistently find ourselves in that dependent state, sometimes our best adaptation, right, is not to mobilize because we can't leave, because we can't overcome our response, right, won't overtake in some circumstances the power or the might, if you will, of the other person. So we then fall into those more shutdown based responses. And I think one in particular that I know a lot of women resonate with is the very human kind of adaptation that separates us to some extent from animals, where we have learned socially a beautiful adaptation, which is almost to be preventative, to be so attuned to the environment around us that we can determine or assess, which is what our nervous system is doing anyway. All of our nervous systems do this to keep ourselves safe, but we can be so attuned to the cues, right, that a lack of safety is happening in our environment, right? That our family or our parent is becoming explosive. Maybe that becomes our partner is becoming explosive. For me, it wasn't necessarily the explosion I was trying to avoid, but I had a shut down mother, an emotionally withdrawn mother. So what I was almost the other side of that spectrum, right? I was looking for the small moments where my mom was able to give me attention, was able to give me validation, was able to give me love and connection. Right. So in those moments, I was still much like, right, the person who's always on alert for the next explosion. I always was on alert. And so when we can prevent, or so we think, right, by anticipating a threat and by intervening before it becomes threatening, before the explosion, right, when I could get so attuned to what my mom likes so that she can come and celebrate me in those moments, and then so attuned to what she doesn't like and causes that disconnection, and I can avoid doing those things to, right, sustain my bond. And now you have women in general who perhaps culturally, depending on, their resources, are completely dependent. Now we can see, I think, why a lot of women go into that fawn response, where they continue to be the caretaker, right? The hypervigilant, the person who's just so empathetic. And these are all things I think we tell ourselves that describe this orientation of external attention, right? External attunement. I'm not even attuned to myself. I'm attuned to everyone around me and these subtle shifts and changes, so that I can spring into action, whatever that looks like. So of course, I'm describing a lot of the behaviors that we notice, because for some of us, especially if we're in that shutdown state of freezing, of fawning, of eventually fainting, which I did twice, which was very scary. And so for me, having this new awareness, having this new language opened the possibility that maybe through new changes, through new choices I make throughout the day that include my body and that include nervous system wellness, maybe then I can start to break some of these behavioral patterns, right, of being focused outward, of always worrying about someone else, so that I can resolve at the core of what's driving them.
Nicole, this brings up so many different things for me. I'm curious, now that you've integrated, now that you have this sense, especially of some of the drivers that you had growing up, some of the trauma that you experienced, how do you now measure dysregulation in the body? And what I love about this conversation with you is that you've thought so carefully and so profoundly about the mind and the nervous system and how it gets dysregulated. I've thought so carefully about the physiology and how these experiences of dysregulation show up in the nervous system, yes, but also in your blood sugar, in your heart rate, in your heart rate variability, the time between each of your heartbeats. And so I'm curious, now, how do you measure dysregulation?
So for me, again, because so much of my work, or the hope from my work, is to empower the individual to be able to, right, when I say empower, I mean to be present in their body and to be attuned or connected to what I think is the true source of wisdom, of intuition, right, of guidance, which is the self, right, the inner being, the body. And I'm very intentionally saying this because I get asked quite often in terms of what are signs, what are tools for sadness, right? And people naturally want the universal protocol, or at least the protocol that will work for them. And so in this, I think, is a beautifully aligned with the gender conversation too, with this outsourcing fawning, or I should say with the fawning, the outsourcing of attention. What comes along with that is the outsourcing of knowledge, information, trust, confidence. And a lot of times, right, that I think for very well-intentioned reasons happens in our medical system, right? We go, and I watch this with my mom. My mom's suffering from chronic illness, chronic pain, quite literally from my entire life, and going to doctor after doctor, right? And desperately in pain with symptoms, scared, trying to seek not only the reason, the diagnosis, but the treatment plan, right? And I would see her desperate and then just hang on, right? What that doctor said, apply it, whether or not it worked or applied to her or not, and then ultimately would go and find the next doctor with another piece of information and then wholeheartedly. So sharing that because I think that a lot of us have experienced that patterning or those, kind of relationships where we have the person that we trust more than ourselves. And a lot of times I think that goes hand in hand with, support service, the medical system. And of course, I was part of the system in a lot of ways, but I think the system would be of greater benefit if the goal was to support individuals in their own empowerment.
It's such a critical point because in medicine, we're taught this top-down approach, right? Where the physician goes through all this training and has some understanding, or the therapist, the psychologist went through all this training, has the answers. And then we take these answers, whether they're relevant to us or not, and try to personalize them. And it's often a failed experiment. It ends up being, sort of this process of trial and error that adds to the exhaustion and can add to the dysregulation if it's not something that really works. And what you're describing in your books and in your content is more of a bottom-up process, right? Of starting with yourself first and coming from that place of regulation and really having this inventory for whether you might be doing some of these conditioned responses that you learned as a kid. I also learned to take on the regulation of my mother and to try to, to take responsibility for things that didn't belong to me as a kid, and then to continue that into adulthood until I became more conscious of it. So can you say a little something about bottom up versus this top down approach, kind of the drill sergeant who says, you will do this, you'll start taking metformin for your blood sugar. Doesn't matter that stress and trauma is driving your blood sugar up.
What was coming to mind when I heard you describing that was, I think the more problematic psychological, emotional, if you will, impact of the top-down model is, I think, a continuation of self-invalidation, right? So when we have someone else giving us the idea or telling us directly that they know better, right? Whether it's based on what we're telling them we're feeling and they know that we're not feeling that, or we're feeling this, or it's, a representation of this, or we're fine. I mean, how many listeners even, I imagine, have been told by doctor after doctor, right? You're fine. Blood works normal. Everything's fine. How invalidating when there is that little voice inside that's like, no, something's off. And I'm saying, I think that, in my opinion, is the most problematic outcome of the top-down approach, especially again for women, because I think invalidation is such a core foundational wound for so many of us. So I think, again, the bottom down is teaching the practice of being in a body, as simple as that sounds. Because it's not as simple, like we were discussing earlier. The reason why the large majority of us left our body is because we don't have the resources to deal with the overwhelming stress and upsetting emotions that are still living within our body. Right. So to be told, or even to logically think, right, oh, just bottom up. Okay, that means I'm in a physical body. And okay, Nicole might give me some markers around in terms of shifts my breath might make, my heart rate might make, right, my muscles might make. So I can begin to determine if my body is going into a stress response, which one it might even be going into, right? It is the practice, though, of doing that. And then the reality is that habitual reaction will take over. If we're not equipped to be present to the overwhelming emotions, before we know it, we're right back out of that body. So hand in hand, right, is not just being in a body. It's, for a lot of us, increasing our resilience or our ability to be with the stressful, upsetting, dysregulating emotions at the same time. The mind, top down, while it's very powerful and can play a very large role in creating change in the body, the body is just as powerful, if not more, sending those messages
Yes.
upward.
Yes. The intelligence of the body is something that is so overlooked, at least in conventional medicine. And I want to slow down here for a moment. You are talking about this map that I think is so helpful for people. And when you think about people who maybe get stuck in a stress response, maybe have, you talked about the mobilization of energy in a stress response, fight, flight, the mobilization versus this more immobilized response. And I'm curious, how do you distinguish between a normal stress response and something that's chronically dysregulated?
I really appreciate this question, mainly because it implies the reality that expanded, that emotions are normal, are part of our day-to-day life. And I'm emphasizing this very slowly here, pausing to do so, because I do believe some of us have this anticipation or maybe even hope, expectation that the goal or even the possibility is to become, right, this Zen-like Buddha who's never stressed or upset and everything else just kind of goes away. And I always just feel calm and grounded. And that's not the reality. So it is very beautiful to really continue to emphasize and support in ourselves that emotions, stress included, have evolutionary value. They're important. They're a natural part of our experience. They give us important information. The goal would be to develop a resilient relationship with them, the ability to be present, the ability to be grounded in terms of what's happening when they're happening in our body without losing control, without reacting. And then the ability to come back into that calm baseline as quick as possible. The marker of a normal stress response is that when it happens, A, you don't go offline, right? You don't black out, tune out, kind of come to in an eruption, an implosion or an explosion later. You're able to be present to your upset. It might feel crappy, right? But you're there. You're able to stay grounded with what's happening. And there's a time in the future, and it might vary, a couple minutes, maybe an hour or two, depending on the upset, where it goes away. If the reaction you're having is overwhelming, if you do black out, you come to later, right? You lose total control. You feel like, what do you mean, Nicole, have control over an emotion? When an emotion happens, it takes over me. I become the emotion, right? I am the reaction of the emotion, right? So that's a sign usually of dysregulation, as well as when the stress never goes away. And like I was describing, right, this little anxious girl afraid of the world, anxiety was constant. It is so wild to me. I almost have to remember at this point, Sarah, it's so funny. I have to remember to continue to tell the part of my story to some extent where I was the anxious, panic-ridden person. Now I have moments where I'm activated, where I could feel a version of, right, stress or anxiety, but it's not chronic. I mean, quite literally, that's what I was taught. Anxiety is for a lifetime. The conversation is about managing it. So without that contrast, without contrasting information, right, it's hard for us to even notice. We become so used to or habituated to our body in these nervous system responses that we begin to just say it's us. So it's wild to me now to remind myself to share with the community that, I know what it's like to be so identified and so stuck in these responses. And as I was sharing, it ended for me in very scary moments of losing consciousness, which thankfully inspired, as it does for many of us, driven by my health anxiety. I went online, I started to Google. I was going to diagnose where in my brain, right, this hypothetical tumor was. And thank God I did that, because what I saw was just information after information that included this reality and gave me a possibility that what was happening for me was I was stuck. And I couldn't even tell I was stuck because I never had a moment of not feeling anxiety.
Yeah, I want to connect the dots here because you're giving people so much hope. What you described as needing to remember what it was like when you were in a state of dysregulation, because once you have that feeling of regulation and you feel it most of the time, in some ways there's no going back. Like, you just aren't willing to consent to that anymore. And talking about the feigning is also helpful to me. And I just want to help folks connect the dots here that I grew up with a mother who would faint like every 6 months. And she would get a workup. She'd go to the emergency room. They would find no cause. I had a couple of fainting episodes when I was in my 30s and 40s. And I really believe that this is at the root of it. When you were talking about the mobilization response, the sympathetic nervous system fight flight that was defined in men, I had a sense of how this maps to power and how fight flight really has been about power over, and how a more female response of freeze, fawn, faint is power under. And, what we're looking for is power with. We're trying to find the way to work with our nervous system and with our stress response so that we can have power with. And this also reminds me of the racial issues that we're facing right now. And I remember reading maybe 5-10 years ago about the weathering hypothesis and how Black women in particular have this experience of premature aging related to the stress response that is far bigger than what you see in Black men. It's far bigger than what you see in other races and ethnicities. And I feel like we need to understand that, yes, this affects us individually, but it also affects us collectively. Any thoughts that you want to share about this idea of power over, power under, power with, and the stress response?
The thought that comes to mind and the experience I've had it myself, to come up the ladder. I think a very common reference, right, from the nervous system, the bottom rung, if you will, of the freeze, the fawn, the shutdown, right? Really simplifying again. To come into the socially engaged, right, ventral vagal, we have to come up through, if you will, we have to mobilize our energy. We have to learn how to be present, right, to the mobilized energy, which for a lot of us, there's a lot of mobilized energy because anger, right, which is a very activating energy, which I think drives a lot of that fight or flight response. And again, anger is evolutionarily appropriate for all of the instances where our needs are going unmet or chronically unmet or we're being violated, right? So now, anger being normal, completely normal, right? When we reconnect to our body, become present, just like we've been talking about, when we want to kind of come up the ladder or resolve, go back into balanced connection, we have to learn how to adaptively not only be present with that mobilized energy, how to channel it, right? How to allow it to leave our body. And so when I'm hearing and thinking about just starting with myself before we even talk about kind of power and culturally and societally, that's very uncomfortable, right? For me as an individual. The reason why I lived, as I call it, on my spaceship in that state of disconnected dissociation for so long, like I've been sharing, is because those energies were too much. And the way that anger in my family was modeled, it was one of two things. My dad seemingly always agitated. He was very much stuck in that fight or flight version of too high cortisol. And that came out with agitation, at times yelling, explosion, right? Throwing things, not necessarily at anyone, at the wall, but just overwhelming upset, anger. My mom on the other side, her anger was shut down, silent treatment. So I didn't have any adaptive modeling of how to be with or channel my anger appropriately. Because again, anger is an appropriate response for those circumstances. So now let's map this onto the conversation about culture, about race, about everything in between. If and when, not only if our modeling hasn't been how to be with this adaptive force that is our mobilized energy of anger, if what society and culturally we're being told about anger, if the actual like systemic, structure of our system doesn't support us being with anger, right, then it's going to be very hard to consistently learn an adaptive relationship with anger. And that's the reality for a lot of communities, is structurally, is the beliefs embedded in their culture, right, is to some extent villainize, avoid, not setting up the circumstances externally for anger to be okay and to have an appropriate outlet. So again, I think it just results in a continued stuckness to come back up into that calm, grounded, engaged state, which then has, I think, the byproducts like you're describing in terms of aging, in terms of immune system functioning, in terms of inflammation, really, and everything in between that is a marker, again, of our body being in those dysregulated states. Addiction, let me throw that in too, because I believe these dysfunctional habits, and again, without understanding where it's coming from, without having the tools then to embody new relationships with our stress, with our trauma, with our dysregulated emotions, then a lot of us run the risk of just staying stuck at the bottom of the ladder or wherever it is that we're stuck.
Yeah. So, reminder for our listeners to think about that ladder. Like, where are you on the ladder? And what sort of skills could you start to gather today to climb that ladder? You mentioned cortisol, so I want to dive into cortisol. It feels like we're going to have a fresh conversation about cortisol and what it does. How do you think about cortisol in the context of the stress response? You talked about anger. And I want to kind of broaden the way we think about anger because so many women that I take care of don't identify with anger. They subsume it, they put it in their jaw. They've got TMJ, they've got autoimmunity, they've got blood sugar dysregulation, which we know tracks with trauma. They've got chronic endocrine dysfunction, of which cortisol is just part of the story. Insulin can also be involved. So tell us about the way you approach cortisol.
Cortisol, again, is foundational to the extent that it's connected. I mean, it is the hormone, if you will, that governs, that helps our body regulate its nervous system response. So cortisol naturally helps us in our daily cycles, our daily rhythm. The ability to wake up first thing in the morning happens because cortisol spikes a bit, activating, just like we're talking about, our body for the day. And then if all is going well in a regulated body, our cortisol is decreasing over the course of the day into the evening so that by evening time, I can actually allow my body to shift from that sympathetic state of activation, which we need to some extent to be present to our day, into that calming state. Though, of course, that's not the reality a lot of us experience. And so, we, to some extent, villainize, I think, our stress response in general. Like I was saying, we want to throw all of the emotions out with stress, and we want to just have this idea that we can be calm and grounded all the time. And again, cortisol going hand in hand with the stress response. Cortisol isn't the problem. It's the dysregulated rhythm of cortisol, again, within our body. So, we need cortisol, but I think the symptoms that a lot of us are experiencing, like I was talking about earlier, wired and tired, waking up exhausted, feeling like, naps don't work. We feel worse after our nap, and all of these cognitive, not just feeling alert, all come again because our cortisol is dysregulated. And for me, cortisol, going even back to my hypothetical or my feared brain issue, the reason why I went right to the possibility of the tumor when I started to faint went hand in hand with a very common experience I now know to be common since I've talked about it so frequently. In as long as I can remember, I couldn't remember. And what I mean when I say that is I had the experience somewhere around high school, usually when I'm hanging with my friends and, this friend tells a story about childhood birthday or childhood Christmas. And I'm like, didn't have anything to share, couldn't really recall my early life and thought, it's interesting. Mind you, I was in high school. So then when that started to happen, my friend was like, oh my God, remember that party last weekend? Or remember the last time we were here? And again, blank face on Nicole. Well, of course, I have a new explanation for these moments. I was partying, I was drinking. Nicole's always, messed up. So which again went hand in hand with my best attempt in those high school years, finding alcohol, finding marijuana, buying pharmaceuticals, if I'm being perfectly honest, off the street, All of that to me felt better than the lifetime of anxiety. Also allowed me to be more social. That little girl afraid of the world was quite literally afraid of people, painfully shy. I had very few friends up until high school. So now I discovered this way to numb myself. I was the party fun girl, And then the byproduct was, of course, I can't remember because I'm having such a fun time partying. Then I flash forward into college, into graduate school. I actually learned about something that is called autobiographical memory disorder. And I remember it to this day because I thought, and I volunteered for a study because I thought I was part of this unique population of individuals that had this, very unique genetic thing that results in their inability to recall their autobiography or their past. So meanwhile, I'm like, something's wrong in my brain for sure. Worrying as life goes on, can't remember. And then again, I started fainting. And what I've come to realize is that cortisol was playing and played such a foundational role in that inability to recall my past. Because for me, my overwhelm with cortisol began, and this was something I learned later in life, when I was in utero. Because my mom, I have two siblings who are much older than me. I was not an unplanned pregnancy. So I have a brother who's 18 years older than me, a sister who's 15 years older than me. And my sisters, like my mom, struggled with chronic health issues. So my mom, having chronic health anxiety from her own past, from her own experience with my sister, when she started to have symptoms, and was a story shared with me actually at my mom's funeral just a couple of years ago by my aunt who was there at the time and said, oh my gosh, I was at the dinner. It was so funny. I have to tell you this funny story, Nicole. We were out to dinner, long story short, and your mom goes to the bathroom and she's not coming back for a long time. So your dad is like, hey, can you go check on her and make sure she's okay? So aunt goes into the bathroom and my mom discloses to her in tears that she's quite convinced that she has stomach cancer because of the symptoms of morning sickness that she had began to have, having no idea at 42 years old that it was a pregnancy that had happened. So I share that because the amount of stress before my mom was an urge to go to the doctor within the next couple of weeks and then was diagnosed as pregnant, surprise, it's me. Meanwhile, I think about developmentally, right, how that was for me and the amount of cortisol, very understandably. My mom was stressed probably near constant until she got that diagnosis. And to be honest, she was probably stressed after that because she was afraid at age 42, right, with the previous child with chronic health issues that I was just a ticking time bomb. God knows what I was going to have. So talk about stress. And so for me, that language now of cortisol and the impact that it has on the hippocampus, right, this memory, this place that plays a role in our brain of being able to recall memories. But I want to be clear here because then the question I get followed up with near immediately is, well, how do I heal? What if I can't go back? I'm like you, Nicole, because as I started to share this, there's a lot of people like, oh my gosh, thought something was wrong with me too. And so to be clear, we can't recall what happened, though in my opinion, we are living the memory of it and exactly what we're talking about here. Our body has the memory of these elevated cortisol levels, of this dysregulation, of all of these behavioral adaptations, sometimes in being even our identity, right? I'm the caregiver and this is who I am, not how I've become.
Yeah, cortisol, it's so interesting for you to map what happened with your mother and what you imagine the cortisol environment was for you when you were in her uterus. Because the way, I'm known for my work with hormones, and my work really started with cortisol and how critical it is to other hormones. So a lot of people come to me because they want to hear about estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and I tell them, listen, cortisol is a dictator. Like it is determining your level of other hormones. It maps to so many different functions in the body. As you described, there's this normal pattern each day, almost like a lasagna that opens to the sun and then closes by the end of the day. We need to have cortisol to send blood flow to our muscles, to go into fight flight, to modulate the immune system, to control blood sugar. It's really important. It's called a glucocorticoid, meaning that it's involved in managing glucose. And what I see is that when I look at the patients I've taken care of over the past 30 years, 90% of them have problems with their cortisol. And it's something that's flying below the radar of conventional medicine. When I first checked them in my 30s, my cortisol was 3 times what it should have been. And I remember going to one of my mentors, Louanne Brissendine, and said, here's where I am with my cortisol levels. And she said, oh yeah, every female doctor I know has a cortisol that's 3 times what it should be. And, this causes a lot of problems. And like you, I feel like my mother was going through a separation and divorce when she was pregnant with me. There was a lot of cortisol happening, I imagine. So how do you think about the measurement of cortisol? Is there a rule of measurement? What if you learned with your own measurement?
So funny timing of this. I actually just got my blood work done for the first time in a very long time this past week. So I don't yet have any of the test. But saying that to say, I've been focusing the large majority on that bottom-up approach of me learning what it feels like in my body as my stress level and my dysregulation, right, begins, as opposed to getting the external marker to see. I think about this a lot too, which is all the gadgets that exist now, right? We have Aura rings and these assessors and that sensor. And I'm always kind of 2 minds with, from labs and blood work to this, right? And again, it applies to the same conversation we were having earlier. When we can't see, right, inside of our body, when we can't sense, right, shifts in, our heart rate to the extent that these rings can, right? That can be valuable to use hand in hand, I think, with the bottom-up approach. Where it can become slightly problematic is when there's an over-reliance on these more externally generated numbers or even internally generated numbers in terms of blood work. And right, for some of us, it's the only way that we get an assessment. But again, I'm always just hesitant to do that in absence of, well, let me learn my own markers. So for me,
Exactly right. So we need both. And for the folks who tend to numb out, who tend to freeze, who tend to have what I think of as functional dissociation, of which I'm one of them, I feel like these wearables can be so helpful because when you put it together with those bottom up approaches, it allows you to kind of look at window of tolerance, sort of what you're able to tolerate. And especially for people who have high sensitivity. And I want to talk a bit about boundaries and sensitivity here too. I'm someone who's highly, highly sensitive and I get overstimulated very easily. And I always had that pathologized when I was younger, even until, frankly, my 50s. And what I've learned is that, people with high sensitivity they're like orchids. They need the right conditions. And once they learn how to give the right conditions, they bloom and they bloom and they bloom. So I wonder if you can help us with understanding how cortisol is related to boundaries and also this sense of, sensitivity, which I think is one of those components that makes us more easily dysregulated.
absolutely. And we vary individually in terms of our sensitivity. And again, it's smiling as I refer to myself, right, and I brought up my social. I was socially really, really painfully shy. It was to some extent pathologized, right? I had always gotten the message, or I knew that my family or my mom in particular wanted me to socialize, wanted me to have friends. I was put in, all of the different socializations from the second that they would accept me as my certain age in school, right? So I always knew that kind of socially being more extroverted, for lack of a better word, was more celebrated. And so interestingly, you hear me say, well, when I learned how to numb, I was able to be much more social, to the extent that it surprised my mom in high school when she would start to hear from friends the way they would describe me if we were like hanging out at my house or around her, and they'd be, oh, Nicole's so fun. She'd be like, my Nicole? Because she, right, had that memory of Nicole being the little girl that wouldn't even give her order the waiter at a restaurant. Now, again, I think it's maybe worthy for me to mention here in Philadelphia, in a very urban setting where quite literally I shared a wall with my neighbor. So I heard everything through the wall. I lived on a major street. So I heard every siren, every accident that happened. There was crime. One of the stories my family loves to share too is 3 days after I was brought home from the hospital, there was a fire in my garage. My neighbor's house was broken into, right? So all of this stress out there and my inherent sensitivity, right, resulted in me being this presenting, right, this extremely shy, fearful, hiding under tables little girl. And so when we begin to talk about empowered choices, we can begin to talk about boundaries, limits, how we manage our stress, which begins with first becoming aware of our body as it's kind of going up and down that ladder or leaving our resource states. We begin to notice, and again, I'm really simplifying the process of this, but we begin to notice how we experience certain environments, certain people, certain topics, right? And if and when we come to the conclusion that certain people, topics, environments that we're engaging with consistently or living within the relationship or the environment that is, are exacerbating our stress or are not allowing our body to come safely back into that calm, grounded state, then the most empowered choices we can begin to make are to create boundaries around our limits, or to state our limits. Boundaries are our way to empower ourselves to create or to make choices, I should say, that allow our body to deal with and process our stress and our upsetting emotions. And boundaries are, again, I want to emphasize this as we end on the for us. Boundaries are choices we can make anticipating that no one else or nothing else will change outside of us. How can I create space, or how can I make a choice in these moments that will allow my body to, at first, maybe just not increase its stress. And then over time, how can I learn to calm and regulate my body?
So I love this idea of boundaries as a sacred tool. So as you said, the first phase is to use boundaries, to explore them as a way to not increase your dysregulation, increase your chronic stress response. And then over time, they become this tool that can become more refined and really support you in spending as much time regulated as possible. I'm so curious about the science of boundaries. And, I think I can feel as you're talking some of these boundaries, real or imaginary lines between two things that exist physically in the body, like the boundary between the outside world and the inside world that exists in your gut, and sometimes is only one cell thick, the boundary between your body and your brain, the blood-brain barrier, and how dysregulation affects these boundaries too, how they can cause harm to these boundaries too. So, from more of a scientific perspective, tell us about the tool of boundaries. I imagine, for instance, when you set a boundary, and I want to hear about some of your boundaries that you're working with right now. When you set a boundary and it's transgressed by someone or even by yourself, there's a stress response. There's a rise in epinephrine, adrenaline, norepinephrine, then cortisol. How do you think about the science of boundaries and maybe help to fill in some of the details here with boundaries and the stress response?
So those points of demarcation, those boundaries, those limits, separation, right, between me and you, space, internally, externally, wherever it exists. It exists as a form of protection, mainly to keep us safe, right? To keep the contents of our guts in our guts and not traveling through our body to activate an immune system response. And so when these barriers are broken, right, when the stress causes, or the dysbiosis in our gut, right, causes the lining to be punctured so that, right, the contents similarly in our brain, right, when these barriers begin to weaken, then what happens? Things leak out, right? And then the body, doing beautifully what the body is trained to do, begin to deal with what it believes to be toxic, right? An invader, a problem. And I think another kind of science that I want to expand beyond the internal world is energy, right? That neuroception, that energetic sensor, right, is going beyond our body. We can't see it, right? I'm able to sense, and I think common experiences of this, if you walk into a room and there's no conversation now, but you can clearly tell that the two people in the room have been fighting, right? You feel the tension. Similarly, if you come upon someone who's having a joyous, beautiful day, you feel the lightness or the joy. So these energetic boundaries, limits exist as well. But those, I think, are the more difficult ones to become aware of because we can't see it, right? We can just learn how to feel it. What happens again scientifically is ourselves and whoever else is in the interaction with us, within our relationships in the environment, because of that unseen communication between both of our nervous systems, both are unsafe in that moment. We are both going to be probably activated by our nervous system into our habitual stress response.
Yes. I so appreciate the way that you're making this bigger case for when you've got two nervous systems that are dysregulated and they're trying to, create that bottom up regulation or are using tactics that aren't working. I want to make sure that we cover two last things before we finish. The first is when people should seek help and what type of help they should seek. And then I'd love to leave our listeners with the techniques that you found to be the most helpful in terms of supporting your path from dysregulation to regulation.
So I'll start with those techniques because they're just such a foundational part of my journey. And again, whether or not we have access to the support, and I could talk a little bit about that at the end, I believe that, we can begin to make empowered choices that will allow us to create change. And for me, again, that meant including my body in my daily conversation, which was a huge embodiment shift from the habitual way I was living, which was, as the large majority of us are, driven by that autopilot. My autopilot being, right, stuck in functional freeze, living on this spaceship. And so for me, it was the daily commitment to, first and foremost, you will always hear me cite the foundation of change is learning how to actualize choice. And that begins when we become conscious or aware. Simply when we shift from that autopilot that's going to just habitually do what it always does, habitually assign the same interpretation or meaning to the events, right? Habitually deal with the cortisol or the, upset or anger in the same habitual way. When we become present, like we've been talking about, and are able to say, okay, this is what's happening in my body. I can notice what's happening in my mind. I can almost even feel the instinctual desire or what feels like an instinctual desire to do that same habitual thing. And I can still remain tethered, if you will, to that grounded conscious state of awareness that can say, and I can make a different choice, an intentional choice at that moment. Because without that, and this is why you're always going to hear me talk about consciousness or an awareness practice, right? Really learning to fire up that prefrontal cortex and not just be driven by that emotional limbic system. Because without that, we will continue to repeat the autopilot because our body and our brain prefer it. It allows us to coast with less energetic resources. I mean, there's a million reasons, right? We're convinced that's the only way to keep us safe, keep us connected in our relationships. So why would we change? So again, I can't emphasize how foundational that consciousness practice is. It looks as simple as noticing throughout your day, maybe setting a reminder, maybe putting a Post-it note up, just taking a moment to pause from what you're doing and first notice, where was your attention when that alarm went off or at that moment in time when you're doing this check-in? Right? Were you lost in thought somewhere else entirely? What were you thinking about? What were you paying attention to? And in that moment, when you probably come to the conclusion, as a lot of us will, or see I wasn't present, I wasn't in my body at all, I wasn't engaged with what I'm doing, we can then begin to build that muscle, right? Refocusing our attention, whether you're using the anchor of your breath, whether you're using a more kind of traditional grounding or rooting practice where you really just turn your attention to all different points of contact where you can actually feel yourself in a body, supported by whether it's the chair, the ground, the bed beneath you. And when we're doing that, again, back to this concept of embodiment, we're flexing that muscle. We're firing up the more powerful conscious part of our brain. And we're beginning to lay down by doing that repetitively, right? We're going to begin to set in the possibility that we can maintain that tether that I was describing in real time. What has shifted though is I'm aware and I have the intentional choice available to me should I wish to choose it. And then I got really grounded and foundational in terms of creating lifestyle choices or habits that allowed me to build nervous system wellness, paying attention to what I eat, removing all of the inflammatory gut damaging foods that I was near living on, paying attention to how much I'm moving or resting my body. What do my sleep habits look like? That meant for me, getting myself an earlier bedtime so that I could wake up earlier in the morning so I can get morning sun. I have time to gently move my body because what became clear to me, all of this lifetime of constriction actually began to hunch my posture a bit to the extent that, you were talking about earlier, Sarah, tense jaws. My entire mid to upper back might as well have been one ball of tension. So for me,
Yes.
right, gradually, and this isn't me spending hours at the gym. It's not me doing hour and a half yoga practices. I started with 10, 15 minutes, a walk around the city neighborhood that I was still living in when I began this journey. I don't identify with anxiety anymore. I definitely have a lot. I want to be clear. There's a lot of that wiring, as is the case for all of us, still in there. A lot of old habits still are at the ready. And we can apply this when my boundaries aren't where they need to be, when my stress or my cortisol is higher and I'm not taking time to rebalance or to regulate my body. Those are the moments where these old habits creep back in. So then in terms of help and support, one of the reasons why I started to share, this content free on social media, which is where it all began many years ago, is because I became really aware of how inaccessible sometimes support is for so many of us. I became very aware of how global the community was that was forming around the Holistic Psychologist account. And I know that not all, systems have the access to helping individuals in other countries. We are interpersonal creatures. We need support. So even if the large majority of us aren't maybe feeling supported, even if we do have active relationships around us, we need to find the way. And a lot of times we don't feel supported is the nature of the conversation that we're talking about here, right? Based on this conditioning, all these adaptations. For some of us, disconnecting from the world that was too scary, too overwhelming, too hurtful became the most protective thing. So we desperately want and need these relationships. And this is really what inspired this latest book, mainly on relationships, though it focuses a lot on the relationship with self, on building nervous system wellness so that we can then truly be authentically connected, be caring, compassionate individuals with other people.
Yes. Yes. And The problem is not just inaccessibility of the mental health systems that currently exist. It's also from my read of the literature that if you're someone with trauma, and that's 70% of women, if not higher, talk therapy is not that effective. The efficacy from my look at the literature is about 30%. And you can even add in some selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. There's 3 that are FDA approved for post-traumatic stress disorder. They're not that effective. So when you're talking about these other solutions, and I want to finish our conversation with the one solution that you've really found to be the most effective. You've given us so many today. And I'm curious if it's that bottom-up regulation, that awareness practice. Is it more relational? I know it's hard to pick one, but if you had to pick one, what would you say has been the most effective for you, especially recently?
I believe that the foundation of an empowered life, which includes changing, transforming, relieving of symptoms for a lot of us, begins and ends, is created in that empowered state of awareness. Because once we learn how to notice when we're not fully tuned in to our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual experience in any given moment, and then have that muscle flexed, built enough, strong enough to tune in, now we have a foundation that we can springboard into all of the different areas, right, that you even just mentioned very beautifully, right? Now I can pay attention to my body and stress response and learn more adaptive ways to regulate it when it's dysregulated. I could pay attention to all these habitual actions or reactions in my relationships that are not allowing me to create the bonds or the attachments, the connections that I want. And then I can start to make new power choices in that area. Because another reason why I like to empower the individual to use the kind of internal marker, right, the bottom-up approach, is because another reality of being human, which is quite difficult for a lot of us, myself included, as I now begin or continue, I should say, to age, is that we change, right? That our needs very well may differ over time. So unless I, right, foundationally learn, my emotions and perspectives might even shift in any given context or relationship. Simply, I can't just say, here's my healthy lifestyle plan for me as an individual, for me as in a relationship, that I'll apply forever, because that might not apply to every circumstance, right, that your algorithm allowed for. So what I'm getting to here, right, is to be empowered, right, means to be connected from within, means to simply learn how to tune in into the conscious life that we're living. Because back to that body that's incredibly intelligent, the information, the intuition, the guidance that we're looking for, so many of us from out there exist in any given moment. If we're empowered enough to be conscious to what's truly happening in our experience, whether it's internal or external, and then when we gift ourselves the opportunity to intentionally choose how we show up in that moment, then, like I said, that builds the foundation for us to create change or evolution or growth in any area into the foreseeable, unforeseeable, ever-changing future.
Nicole, I'm getting misty as you speak to empowered self-awareness. I feel like I've come to the same conclusion by different methods. And it's such a beautiful way to finish this conversation. There's so many things I want to keep talking to you about, but I realize that we have to go back to the world and the world we serve. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. And I don't know if there are any people left who haven't heard about you and don't know where to find you, but say they wanted to hang out with you on Instagram or go to your website. Could you just share the best way for people to connect?
I would love for people to stay connected, to join all the incredible communities now that exist across each and every social media platform. We actually just created a Pinterest account. So quite literally now, I don't think there is a social media platform that exists that doesn't have some landing page, if you will, of the holistic psychologist as the handle. Of course, it all did begin on that Instagram account, the.holisticspsychologist.com, though I'm shouting out all of these different platforms because these conversations, again, free, accessible tools are being talked about daily, as well as incredible communities across all of the platforms. So in my opinion, it's not even just about what's in the meme, right? If you will, it's about what's in the comments. And I know so many individuals, whether or not they're taking the resources, from the content itself, or whether or not they're taking the healing of just hearing other people's journeys. So much of healing for me to this day remains existing in community. The website, theholisticspsychologist.com, definitely something to check out. I have a mailing list, an email list. Of course, I don't spam. Every Sunday, I send out an email, usually content driven with, information with resources. I'm referencing that. The team just put together an incredible workbook specifically around complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, and it is free. It's released. All these resources that I put out are typically released through that email list. So you go to the website, theholisticspsychologist.com, you sign up for the email list, and then you'll have access to not only that workbook, all of the resources. So definitely another place that I'd want to shout out on that website as well is information about the membership Self-Healer Circle.
Magnificent. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Nicole LePera, for the empowered self-awareness that you cultivated and have been working with over the decades. I want to thank you for your incredible books, for the ways that you teach us to become regulated. You started off in a rough way, and you were able to find how to heal yourself and then how to share that, how to pay it forward. And I am eternally grateful. So thank you for this conversation. I look forward to our next one.
Oh, of course. And I'm going to reflect all that gratitude right back your way, Sara. Just thank you for who you are in the world, for the embodiment that you project so beautifully to all of us, the support and guidance that you offer so many. It is truly my honor to be connected with someone like yourself. Hopefully, one of our next conversations in not so distant future can be about how beautifully integrative our medical and psychological system is becoming, but we will shelf that for a minute. I will hold the vision and continue to look forward to future collaborations with you and your community.
Yes, please. So may the regulation continue. Thank you, everyone, for regulating with us today. Thank you, Dr. Nicole LePera. We will see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone. That was Treated, and I'm Dr. Sara. Thank you for listening. Subscribe wherever you podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, rate it 5 stars. Follow me on Instagram at Sara Gottfried MD. If you have a question, head to speakpipe.com/treated and leave a voicemail. Links to that and more are in the description to this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, be kind to yourself, and remember, your body is always on your side.